Hi there, I'm Madeline, and welcome back to my Watercolor 101 series, where I go over all the things I wish I knew about watercolor before I started. This video is titled Ready, Now What, and we'll go over a handful of little tips and tricks to help you get started. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to set up our art space and supplies, how to prime our paint palettes and half pans, how to take care of our supplies and prevent them from getting water damage, how to make sure our final watercolor pieces dry flat, how to find inspiration for what to paint, how to properly credit other artists when we use their work as inspiration, and at the very end, I'm going to include some bonus material for those of you guys that are interested in creating content either for Instagram, YouTube, or any other social media platform. The first thing I want to talk about is our paint palettes. You can use ceramic, metal, or plastic paint palettes. I personally really like plastic palettes because they're cheap and affordable, and once you figure out how to prime them, I think they work just as well as the nicer ceramic ones. So, paint on plastic naturally will bead. What beading means is the paint clumps together in little paint drops, making it kind of difficult to see what color you are swatching or mixing. To prevent our paint from beading on plastic palettes, there is a way to prime the plastic palette. So to prevent beading, you can use a household cleaner. This is the one that I use and like. It's available on Amazon, and I'll list it below in the description. And all you do is squeeze some cleaner onto the palette and wipe down the entire surface with the cleaner, like how I'm doing right here. After that, the paint shouldn't bead. And this is what it looks like to mix on the paint palette after you have primed it. If you don't want to buy this cleaning agent, another more easily accessible alternative to use is toothpaste. I personally haven't used it, but lots of people have shared with me that it works also. Another thing that's helpful to do before starting out is swatching your entire palette and to have that swatch somewhere visible for you. The reasoning is because dried paint and wet paint on watercolor paper is oftentimes very different color-wise. If you look at these swatches next to their adjacent half pans, you can see, especially with the darker blues and greens, that the color of the dried paint looks nothing like the actual paint when wet on paper. This will help prevent you from picking up the wrong color or the wrong shade. One last topic regarding paint palettes. If you choose to fill your tube paints in half pans instead of palette wells, there's an art to squeezing paint into half pans that allows for the paint to dry evenly without big pockets of air. I usually grab a paper clip, tape some painter's tape onto it, and then I take my tube of paint and I squeeze it into the half pan starting with the corners. I fill the half pan about 2/3 way through, and then I take the paper clip and I stir the wet paint for about 10 to 15 seconds to get rid of air bubbles. I generally like to then wait a few days for it to dry. As it dries, the paint is going to shrink, and afterwards you can pour in a second layer on top of that, repeating the process but being careful not to dig up the paint already poured in. The next thing I want to talk about is water. When you start off, always start off with 2 empty jars of clean water. The rationale is that you always want a clean jar of water to wet your brushes with or to wet your paper with, and then you want a dirty water jar where you will simply use to clean the paint off of your brush. After my brush has been cleaned, I will usually dip the clean brush into the clean water before picking up another color. This prevents extra colors from staying in my brush or accidentally bringing in a new color when I'm pulling the next colors, which can sometimes cause our colors to get muddy. Another tip to preserve your paintbrushes that I didn't know when I first started painting is that you shouldn't leave your brushes in a jar of water. This is because it'll cause unnecessary water damage to the brush. Leave our paintbrushes in jars of water, the water can sometimes seep into this part of the brush where there is glue holding the brush hairs together. The excess water can sometimes cause that glue to break down. So I recommend when you're done painting to wash your watercolor brushes completely and then dry them with a paper towel and then let them to dry flat on your desk. You also want to make sure not to stick your wet brushes back into a jar to dry upright, because that'll cause the same issue, causing water to really get into that part that glues the brush together, so always dry your brushes flat. Sometimes people like to tape their paper down with masking tape so that their painting has nice clean edges. One thing I wish I knew before starting is that when you do this, you want to make sure the paper has completely dried before peeling the masking tape off. If the paper has not completely dried when you remove the tape, then when it does dry, it's more likely for the paper to warp or dry unevenly. This happened to me all the time in the beginning and it drove me crazy. Now I know to let my artwork completely dry, whether it's masking tape or whether it's on the block, so that it dries flat. What about inspiration? Where can you find inspiration for what to paint? My favorite place for inspiration is actually Instagram. I follow so many talented artists, and oftentimes I only need to scroll for a few minutes before I see something that sparks curiosity in me to paint. Another place I like to look for reference photos is either on the website unsplash.com or pixabay.com. These websites have copyright-free photos that are free for artists like me to use and paint from. Whether you are inspired by another artist on Instagram, a YouTube tutorial, or a reference photo, it's proper etiquette to always credit your inspiration whenever you share or post your artwork, even if it's only loosely based off of somebody else. This is best practice. As artists, it's just always really important to acknowledge when someone else's work has been used. If you're worried that your tag might be bothersome to the artist you are inspired by, believe me, it's almost never the case. An artist is usually really flattered to be an inspiration to somebody else. And the saying, copying is the greatest form of flattery, only really holds true if you respect the other artist's work enough to credit it. There's also a saying that those who say copying is the greatest form of flattery never had their work stolen. And this is a pretty big deal in the art community, so I want to try my best to bring awareness to it. The last part of this video is for those of you that are interested in creating content for social media. I get a lot of questions about my filming setup, so I wanted to share with you how I have things set up. You do not in any way need to use the same products I do. I'm just sharing them to give you an idea of how you may want to set your space up. I have a canvas lamp that I use and love, and I prefer my lamp to be clamped onto my desk rather than using it with the base. I find that when it's clamped to the desk, it's much more sturdy and I get a lot less shaking in my video footage. The canvas lamp does come with a light, but I don't always use it because sometimes I find that it leaves me with a really big glare. So the light that I actually use when I'm painting at night is called my BenQ light, which I have over here on the left side. In order to prevent glaring is that you should point the light angle away from you so that it illuminates your space without creating that glare. The BenQ light is actually really nice because it has this function that auto adjusts its brightness and color temperature to its surrounding light. I am not affiliated with BenQ, but I am an affiliate with Canvas. So if you consider buying a canvas lamp, I have a link below in the description that will give you 10% off your purchase. I film with my iPhone 13 and I edit my videos in the app InShot. I'll just add that if you are trying to grow your social media channel, the best way to grow is consistency. I started my account back in February of 2022 and I have posted every single day since. There are definitely seasons when I can post 2 or 3 times a day, and there are seasons when things are just so difficult that all I can do is repost material. My best advice is to follow your gut in terms of sustainability. There is no right or wrong standard when it comes to growing, and reposting content, in my opinion, is the biggest social media growth hack that I can recommend. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope these tips and tricks were helpful in getting you started. The next part of my watercolor series, I will be diving in much deeper with watercolor paints, watercolor brushes, and watercolor paper. Stay tuned. If you haven't seen the first 2 videos in this series, the first video I go over all the supplies that I think you need starting out with watercolor, and the second video is on techniques, all the watercolor techniques that I wish I knew before I started painting. If you want to find these videos, head over to my YouTube channel and go to my playlists, and it'll be under Watercolor for Beginners. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit subscribe, and if you enjoy my content, use the following QR codes to either find me on Patreon or Instagram.